everybody, I'm Amy, this is my wife Maggie,
Hello.
and together we are ThinkerThemer, and guess what, we've done it. We've finished Ticket to Ride, Legends of the West.
We've gone through the 12 games that are the massive saga of Ticket to Ride, and we've got some thoughts. We've got particularly 5 things that we really, really liked, and 4 things that we didn't like as much. Now, anything that we're going to cover here is going to be spoiler-free, so do not stress and fret. There's also not a lot that we can show, but that's for good reason, because we don't want to take the experience away from you.
You don't have to rely on just listening to us and our
Yes,
calming voices, not much B-roll.
do our best to describe, what we can.
Okay, so the first, like any good legacy game, you want surprises.
There are surprises.
There are lots of surprises.
And they come in hard and fast.
They're from like the very end of the very first campaign.
Yeah.
Now I understand why they don't want anyone showing the end of the first campaign, because straight away you get hit with a pretty cool surprise.
Actually, there was a surprise at the very start of reading the story. I just
was.
remember. It was like where I did a literal loud gasp, what? So there's surprises there, and then there's really big surprise, exciting stuff.
There is, but there's lots of different boxes and components to unlock along the way. So, that experience that you have as a collective, where it's like who gets to open the box and find out what's being added to the story, it definitely delivers on that. There are some great fun little surprises along the way. Obviously, we won't spoil what those are, but suffice to say, they're great. So they've ticked the box on adding fun surprises.
The second thing that we really liked are all the new mechanics that are introduced throughout the game, which we had a bit of an anticipation that might happen, but I feel like it really delivered.
It did deliver. I think some of the components you might find similar to previous versions based on what people have told us about some of the other versions of Ticket to Ride.
Easter eggs.
But for the most part, I feel like they are brand new, and they probably are things that you wouldn't expect from a Ticket to Ride game. So there are little twists and turns and little thematic elements that are brought in. They're mostly like adding mini games.
Yeah, so a lot of it kind of works as almost like mini games within the broader game, which I felt worked quite well.
It worked very well.
And it also they didn't really seem to overstay their welcome. As you're kind of playing them, you're not, because it's you're adding a little bit of a thing here and then you're adding a little bit of thing over there. You think by the end of it, are you going to be just completely overwhelmed?
Which can happen with a legacy game. The more things get brought in and people get confused, and what was that rule? And if you go too long between games, then you're like, oh, I've got to remember what all these different pieces do. I thought this game did a really good job of expiring the mini games, or expiring the different mechanics that are introduced. They had a run where they were in there for long enough where it felt satisfying. Maybe they changed the scoring for a bit, but then they would kind of peter out and disappear, and they all had different ways of disappearing out of the game. But I thought that was really, really great. I really liked that about it.
At the same time, one thing that I found is by adding these sort of different elements, it did level up the complexity and the crunchiness of the game. So Ticket to Ride, usually, it's a great gateway game. It's fairly easy and straightforward to get into.
Family friendly.
Yeah, family friendly. This campaign definitely took it, at some point, it was super satisfying and crunchy enough that for even seasoned gamers, you'd be like, oh, actually, there's a lot going on now, and there's a lot to keep track of, and there's some really tough tension type choices that
there
I'm
are
having to
some
make.
things that they ask you to do throughout a round of the game that it's actually really difficult to achieve. In order to do it, maybe you need to sacrifice in other areas, and it was really tough. And because we are similarly matched, and we were playing with my sister as well, who's also very, very good at board games, it was a tight battle. I really liked that about it, because we don't own Ticket to Ride because it's a little bit too light for us. This, to me, was very satisfyingly crunchy in the later episodes, especially as it gets harder and harder.
I also enjoyed how, throughout the different games, the dynamic of even who won and who all of a sudden kind of figured out and cracked something about it, and then that shifted a lot. It wasn't there's always one person that's winning all the games. And I think partly it's because of all those different little things that are introduced, or those mini games and new mechanics that can,
that work your brain in different ways, and so different people would be better at them.
Yeah, caters to different thinking styles.
And while we're on the topic of players, one thing about a legacy game is you always are wondering, what if I start with a group and then one person can't make it, because inevitably that's what always happens.
Life happens.
Life happens. But actually it's really easy to sub out someone in a game. So simply what happens is they don't play that particular game, and then at the end of the game they're going to be assigned points for that missing campaign, essentially. Campaign level. And so basically they're getting a number of points, and that's not revealed though until the end of the game. So you can't be like, well, that sounds like a good amount of points for me just to skip a game. No, you can't do that, because you don't know what that's going to be. We won't talk about what that is.
It's like a default catch-up. And I feel like it's been pretty good, like well-balanced.
Yeah, I would say that that's a very easy, especially for the players who still want to keep playing. I would say, though, if you are missing a game and coming back, there might be something that's been added to the game that you need a little bit of catch-up on from other people. So it's not like you go away and come back and everything's the same. No.
But it shouldn't be onerous. And at the same time, because, you know, that classic style of campaign game, you're adding stickers to the rule book, to the certain areas where now something is a little bit different. So, and it's highly, highly recommended that you do go back every game, no matter how confident you are with the game, and reread through things like the setup and, you know, what a refresh on what are the new things that have come in, and even like end of game, refresh all of that, because otherwise guaranteed you will get lost or miss key components.
Now, the fourth thing that I really liked about this game is it does give you some agency of the direction of the game. So you have a bit of control over what you're choosing to do and when, and that is really fun. It's always great to have a choose your own adventure style thing. The game itself is not completely linear. So the way that you unlock different boxes of content is completely up to the players and the choices that they make along the way. Likewise, there are some cards that you'll get that have certain bonuses, but you'll get a choice over which one you want to uncover for yourself. And so there are parts of the game that might even end up uncovered because of these choices that you're making along the way. So I won't go into that in too much more detail, but it does feel like you really get to create the process. And it's not just this fixed on rails.
On rails. I mean, it is. But not the experience.
But not like that.
Yeah. And I think I agree. Like, I think it was actually really, really good to then have that conversation of, ooh, you know, should we do this as a group? You know, because it usually would happen at the end of a game, and then you're like, and that actually created really nice banter and a really nice experience.
And the final thing that we really liked about this game, number 5, is the ending. The ending and really the crescendo of the game, and that feeling of building and the suspense over who was going to win the entire game, because you put so much time into games like this, and it's so many different matches, and as we spoke about, you know, it wasn't always the case that one player was always winning. It was a real mixture of points. And in this game, as you find out from the very first campaign, so it's not at all
a major spoiler.
It's not a spoiler at all, but you have a company vault, and where you're putting your points in, and you know, you're sliding them into this like thin little slot, and they get securely put away.
It was pretty clever. So it's like a box with 2 compartments. One side is your office, so that's where you're going to store your things
that you're going to bring back
game
out.
To game. And then the other side is the vault, so it just has a slit, and then you're kind of putting things in there,
banking them away.
Banking them away, not to be looked at until the very end of the game.
And so there is this big, because you're scoring points in many different ways throughout this game and putting things into your vault, then at the end it's like uncovering it all and tallying it up, and it walks you through how to tally up all the different parts and all the different points. And then it's like a nail-biting finish. And that's what you want. That's what you want.
Really
you want to be like, oh, you got more points on from those things, and I got more points over here, and who's going to win? And it feels really satisfying.
It was so satisfying to go through all of those, you know, all of the bits that were in there. Because it is like, it's like re-stepping through a lot of the, oh, that's right, that was really cool, or you know, that was,
I did really good on that thing.
That was a good game for me, or like, so all of that was, it was a worthwhile payoff at the end.
Okay, and so into a few things that we liked a little bit less about the game. The first one is really not to do with the game itself, but more the style of game. And so legacy games, they can be really terrible for the environment, especially if it's like a one and done. And I will say that this game, it cannot be reset or recharged in the sense that you can't play through the campaign a second time. You can't hand it off to a friend who's then going to play through it. You are changing, destroying, doing a lot of things to this game.
Permanent changes.
Permanent damage to this game and changes. That means that...
Or improvements.
improvements. But it means that it can't be reset. And what comes along with that is, of course, a lot of, if you're not going to come back to the game, but I'll talk about that in a moment. Obviously, maybe you play through it once and then what do you do with it? Like, do you get rid of it? You can't really sell it. So, and of course, it creates a lot of waste as well because there are a lot of parts in this that get thrown in the trash.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts that become permanently retired from the game. Even though you do end up with a final copy that you can replay, there's still a fair bit of wasted elements.
There are. And so let's go straight into our number 2 dislike. And that is really, it's not really a dislike, but I was a bit disappointed in the game that you're left with. So without any spoilers, there are a few elements that are retained, but mostly everything that you're doing throughout the entire campaign is removed at the end of the game. So if I like to think about it like this, if you think about the original Gateway game, Ticket to Ride, well, the leftover version is like Ticket to Ride Plus.
Yeah.
Probably has like a couple of elements that you don't have in the original Ticket to Ride, but the rest of the campaign was like Ticket to Ride plus, 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 plus.
Yeah.
And so actually once you've experienced all that, coming back to a very stripped out, yes, personalized board because you've done things to the board that permanently will make it the way you designed it to be.
And unique to you. Like no other
copy is
going
to be the same.
Board is going to be the same.
But I don't know if it's enough to make me want to own this version in this box instead of a smaller version of Ticket to Ride.
Yeah.
Like the personalization is not enough and the changes to the game is not really enough that I wonder if most people are going to be like, well, does this have a place in my collection after I've finished the campaign?
Yeah.
And that's going to be a personal decision, of course, but for me, I'm a bit unsure. For me, I loved playing through the campaign.
Yeah.
I really adored it for all the reasons we've already spoken about.
And also, it's just like, it's a reminder of all the things that you're not, like all the amazing things that you're no longer getting to do. And then at the same time, it's not like you can sell it now. So it's not even a game that you can pass on as the leftover base one. I mean, you could, but I don't know many people who would be in the market for.
So I think you just have to like leave it in your collection, decide whether it means that therefore you don't need some other copies of Ticket to Ride. So maybe you sell those and you keep this with the with the thought that this is a fairly stripped back basic version once you're done with the campaign. So that is our number 2 dislike. Now, the third thing is something that I don't really look for in a game, honestly, so it doesn't impact me that much. But the third dislike is really around the overarching story. Now, there were hints at the depth of the story, I suppose.
It might be a bit patchy from the...
just from the back cover.
The back of the box. And I feel like that kind of carried on.
It did.
That promise of a bit patchy delivered.
Yeah.
So the overarching story is, let's say, very lean and sparse. So it's not like a super deep, immersive journey that you're going to be taken into.
No, that you're taking on this story and getting emotional about the story. No, none of that. It's more a means to drive the game forward. Yeah. So it's the story has a little bit of an explanation as to why what is happening around the board, but also because the game is non-linear, it's impossible for the story to do that perfectly because you're making things happen that aren't being covered off by the story deck because the story deck is trying to tell this bigger, broader story. And it was a bit inconsequential for me.
The broader story.
So
what I'll say is like it's more than this collection of little scenes because it's like within each game, there's a lot more little short bits, bursts of story that are not necessarily linked to that main story. Some of them might loosely be. Mostly they're just like their own little snippet of, this is a little story of a moment in time, and it might be like a little side quest.
That's the thing. I think their stories about the time period more than their stories linked back to what's happening in the narrative. So don't go into this thinking it's going to be a huge narrative story. I don't think most people would be going into this particular game with that thought. Anyway, it very much is about the gameplay.
Yeah.
And the fourth minor dislike on this game was we already spoke about the fact that mechanics come in and out of this game very smoothly, and something that we really appreciated about the game. But there are also elements of the game that become redundant with the decisions that players are making.
Because they might be dependent on something else that is now being removed or is now no longer part of the play.
And for the most part, it's pretty smooth sailing to navigate those things. But every now and then I did receive, some kind of objective or something that related to a game, part of the game that was no longer. And it's different to the systems like in Betrayal Legacy, where when something happens that negates a particular part of the game and it removes it, well, then it will tell you to look up particular cards and remove them out of the game. This doesn't have that same system, and I think that's good and bad. On one hand, it's bad because there are things that aren't necessarily going to fit in anymore, like you might just not be able to achieve something and get some coins for that. But the good thing about it is, of course, it reduces the administration in the game.
It reduces it,
So, and that can be quite cumbersome every time to go through, find the things that no longer apply and pull them out of the game. So it's a bit like neither here nor there for me. But a couple of times I was like, oh, well, that's not around anymore.
I think particularly towards the later games, so towards the end part of the campaign, that's when it'll happen more, because a lot of things will have to be retired, or sometimes you might get something, an objective or something that then doesn't actually come into play until like 4 or 5 games later, because of the path that you collectively have taken. Which, I'd say that personally, I don't mind, because it's sort of like, oh, when is this going to happen?
I actually liked that because it was hinting at what was to come. And so every now and then they'd refer to something and you'd be like, what is that?
It's not even...
That must be upcoming. And what does that mean for my next few games? So I thought that part was interesting. The retirement of the components that would come in but weren't relevant, that could have been a little bit smoother. But I totally get that because it's not linear. Very hard to do.
So those were our likes and dislikes of the game. But a lot of people obviously would want to know, well, what about different player counts? What was your experience? Now, we did play this at a 2-player count. And then we also, the majority of the campaign, we kind of played at a 3-player count.
So Maggie and I gave it a go at 2 players just so we could answer this question, and I found that 3 players was ideal for me. So actually the way that it scales is very similar to a regular Ticket to Ride game, in that there are a number of paths that can be taken between cities, and at certain player counts you're locked out of those different pathways. So very easy to implement, but it's the same pathways for a 2-player game as it is for a 3-player game, and then 4 and 5 is separate again. So for our preferences, that 3-player count made for a tighter game experience than the 2-player game. When we played, I found like I had no trouble really getting from place to place.
I'm actually going to disagree a little bit, just because I actually really like the 2-player. Like, I
mean, it's nice, but it's not as tense.
I didn't mind that. Like, I'm just like engaged with it. I enjoyed the 3-player experience, but I agree that it does then make for a more tense experience. You're getting more on each other's way, and so that's kind of player preference. So if you're in a 2-player household or group, I think it'll be fine.
It will be fine, but I'm still going to argue for more players. And the reason why is because the sheer size of the map. This ends up being a very large scale map. And of course, you've got tickets where you're trying to make objectives for different paths. And in a 2-player game, as that map grows, you are going to have a wide open space that I feel like won't have a lot of conflict. And even in our 3-player games, there was quite a bit of conflict. And that's what made it really interesting when, someone took that path that you needed, just like in regular Ticket to Ride. At 4 and 5 players, I imagine that tension would kind of be similar. And then, of course, increase as it moves to 5 players. But then, of course, you're introducing a bit more downtime as you're waiting for your turn to come around. So it really depends on, if you want to make this the best, biggest experience you can, and you're only going to be playing one game together irregularly, I would go for like a large player count and get everybody together when you can around the table, because it is just such a joyful experience. And
also, it makes for very easy, as we said before, it's very easy to, if people can't make it or whatever, like then just have a few games without them and then bring them back in.
Yes. Also, just in general in Ticket to Ride, turn time, the amount of time it takes for one player to have their turn is pretty snappy anyway.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah, so anyway, I think it's going to be a good experience at any player count, but we really enjoyed it at 3. So that's everything for our experience of Ticket to Ride. But, you know, I have to say, this Ticket to Ride Legends of the West Legacy Edition has changed my mind about Ticket to Ride.
It made me really, really, really enjoy Ticket to Ride. Like, it was a solid game beforehand, but I always sort of felt like, oh, you know, it's a bit too light for my taste and preferences now. But it's like, this just kind of got me to, like, fall in love with it. I really, really enjoyed my time with this game.
I really enjoyed the experience of the game too. I like the surprises along the way. I like the little twists and turns. There was enough intrigue, but then there was still enough of a through game that it felt like I was actually getting better as we progressed. And it was a really nice progression because the game gets harder, but you've got more things to do, and yeah, I really liked that about it too. I felt like I feel more bonded to the series of Ticket to Ride after playing this.
I feel like it's like it's unveiled new layers. I thoroughly enjoyed the ride that it took me on.
Like what you did there, very clever. But also, you know, we can't ignore some of those negatives about it. The remaining game, a bit questionable. The environmental impact is still something that we're not very comfortable with. But in terms of the number of hours that we put into, I should talk about that. The number of hours that we put into this game. So I timed every game that we played, and in the beginning games, it is about 20 to 30 minutes, and then by the end, even with tons of complexity, noting that there were only 3 players in our game, we got every game done in under 45 minutes. And that's pretty impressive for a legacy game. It kind of still plays that like mid-weight filler, which is really nice because you're not taking on like a Gloomhaven total campaign that takes over your life.
It also means that you could actually get through a couple of games in a gaming session. So it's like you can go, okay, so tonight let's get through 2 games. Because it's like, well, you know, a couple of hours, you know, even with, you know, a bit of chit-chatting and things like that.
So I think it's going to come down to whether or not you want to spend the money on this kind of what's ideally a one-shot game all the way through. There is enough hours here, we think, to make it worth it. The surprises, the engagement, it's a great game.
It packs a real good experience punch in it. And there is, as you said, a lot of game in it, even if we're not super like sold on the final like leftover bit.
And our group went through Charterstone together. We went through Betrayal Legacy together, and we said that this is probably one of our more favorite legacy experiences. So I mean, that's high praise. We hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please hit like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more board game content soon. But otherwise, bye for now.
Bye.